Welcome and thank you for tuning into another pharmaphorum podcast. In this episode, I speak with Orr Inbar, co-founder and CEO of Tel Aviv-based QuantHealth, about how advances in data and AI can help clinical trial outcomes. It's an interesting and succinct discussion that touches upon key issues in R&D today, but one which also provides notable insights into market differences and the potential to go fully digital and synthetic in the not too distant future. As ever, thank you for listening. Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is your host, Nicole Raleigh, and today I have as guest Orr Inbar, co-founder and CEO of QuantHealth, a Tel Aviv-based AI-powered clinical trial design company. Welcome, Orr.
Hi, how are you? Pleasure to be here.
Lovely to have you. So today we're going to be discussing everything that QuantHealth is doing and also talking about recent advances in data and AI. Today, over 90% of experimental therapies that reach human trials fail to make it to market. These trials fail primarily due to lack of efficacy and safety. Some drugs shouldn't go to trial, while many that do are suboptimally designed. All this is causing trials to become increasingly longer, more expensive, and less effective, while patients aren't getting the drugs they need. And this is where data and AI come in. It has become clear that we can begin to close that gap with the help of technologies. So to this end, today Orr and I will be discussing, as I say, his own journey and learnings in this space. So Orr, please could you share with listeners, with me, a bit more about your background, your journey to today, and then we'll discuss the whys and wherefores for your founding QuantHealth.
Oh, sure. Happy to. So academically, I have a bachelor's degree in biochemistry. I actually started my road in pre-med, and sometime between pre-med and sort of deciding on whether I want to pursue medicine, full time, I realized that in medicine, you typically have to go down a very long road. And then at the end of the day, you're treating one patient at a time. And I was always into computers. And it was pretty clear that with computers are the obvious way to kind of scale things up and have impact across wider populations. And so combining those two seemed like an obvious way to have a bigger impact across medicine. And then I pursued my master's in computer science and did a bunch of research at Harvard and MIT, typically all in and around healthcare and life science. And then around 2017, I co-founded Concert AI, which back then was known as precisionhealth.ai. And that was when I first really got my feet wet in clinical trials and clinical development and got a deeper sense of the pains and pitfalls around clinical trials. And so that's kind of how I got to founding QuantHealth, basically, coming across the problem that you just described quite well.
Thank you. Yes, I believe you founded QuantHealth, as you say, to address the disparities in clinical research that you felt could be overcome with novel quantitative methods. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, basically what's happening is, so pharma is traditionally a very, traditional industry, and they're slow to uptake innovation. And given all the data sets that have become available over the last few years, especially due to COVID, and then the advancements of AI as well over the last few years, those two things coming together over the last 5 to 10 years, and exponentially so in recent years, have just made it that much more viable to really bring about big disruptions in the trial space through these quantitative methods.
Yeah. So thinking about that viability, let's turn to the notion of costs now. With over 90% of drugs failing to make it to market post-clinical trial, amounting to a $50 billion waste each year, how is it, in your opinion, that drug developers, given what we've been discussing, can save money?
So there's kind of two pieces to that equation, right? So there's saving money and there's also making more money. So pharma spends about $200 billion a year on R&D globally. about half of that goes to clinical trials. And as you said, about half of that is wasted essentially on failed trials. And so really what happens is each um, each trial that works or each drug that makes it to market essentially funds the 10 or so other drugs that fail, and all the trials that went into that. So you know, it's a game of risk and reward. And by using technology, essentially, these pharma companies can lower their risk and they can de-risk their drug development programs and go into clinical trials with greater confidence and have a greater probability of success on their clinical programs. And so, if drugs on average fail 90% of the time to make it from phase one and through phase three into the market, we believe that we can bring that number down by about 20%, so that only 70% of drugs fail, and thereby more than doubling the success rate that we currently see in the market. The other piece of that is, of course, the upside, and so pharma companies today see about between two to $3 trillion in revenue globally, and then by doubling the amount of drugs that make it to market and also improving the effectiveness of those drugs, right? The precision of how they're matched to various populations, you get both approximately doubling of revenue, but more importantly, you get greater cost effectiveness across the industry, and just higher, right? So although the pharma companies will ultimately be receiving more money per drug, you would actually have less drugs on the market overall because they would be more effective, right? So what happens today is, if a patient gets a certain drug and it doesn't work, they then move on to another drug, and overall they're just receiving more care that is less efficient. So you kind of also have this third aspect, which is actually reducing costs across the overall healthcare system.
Thank you for that breakdown, Or. So, if we think further on this technology, and you mentioned markets there, given your Israeli roots, how has the process of breaking into the US market with this technology been? What does it take to fundraise also in the current environment?
So, well, I'm not sure that my experience necessarily is indicative of other Israeli founders, just because I'm American, as you can probably tell by my accent.
I can.
And so I have been lucky enough to be able to leverage my network across both the U.S. and Israel. But I think what's interesting is that the Israeli VC ecosystem is, well, it's very vibrant and it's much more resilient. And so in times where during COVID, or then later during the Ukraine war, or even now during the war here in the Middle East, the Israeli ecosystem is quite strong. And biotech has always been a little bit behind in Israel, but cyber and other tech industries here have been very, very strong. And there's been sort of a convergence of those fields here in Israel. So the timing and increasingly so is quite right to seek funding for tech bio companies. And the U.S., especially the Boston and New York scene, have always been strong biotech incubators and technology hubs related to life science. And so we have wonderful investors that are very savvy and bring a lot of experience in our space, both in the U.S. and in Israel. So we're quite fortunate.
Yes, could you go into further detail, perhaps, into QuantHealth's in silico evidence generation approach that can be an invaluable tool for investors to make calculated asset assessments before deploying capital?
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting idea that we've had. It came up about a year ago with some of our investors that, so there's some investors, not a lot, that invest in both tech and biotech. And they asked us if if they could leverage our technology to make better assessments of potential investments in early stage biotech companies. right? Because at the end of the day, if we can predict what clinical trial will be successful or not, then we can provide a lot of value to investors, either private or even public, on which biotechs, to invest in. And so we're still in the early stages of really trying out that business model, but there seems to be a lot of interest in it.
Thank you. So finally, all this considered, what's your outlook for how AI will play out within the clinical trial sector in the coming years? However far forward you want to go with this semi-futuristic technology.
So I think there's two. We can divide it into two main buckets. There is the area of clinical trial recruitment and enrollment. Just finding patients for clinical trials, which is a huge problem today. It's not one that we're solving, but I think in light of your question, it's worth highlighting. And I think we'll see probably much better identification of patients that are relevant for trials. And I think especially by doing so predictively, so actually finding patients who will be eligible for a trial, 6 months or a year down the line, which is not happening today. Today, pharma companies are basically looking at, as they're thinking about where to deploy their clinical trial, across various medical centers and whatnot. They're trying to get an assessment of where most of the relevant patients will be, but they're only doing that by looking at patients who are essentially, eligible for the trial today. When in reality, it's a dynamic picture, right? And patients constantly, their clinical status changes, and so they might be eligible for the trial one day, but then no longer eligible another day. And so that'll be one area where I think AI will be used to be much more precise and proactive about patient enrollment in trials. And then the other, which is more relevant to what we're doing, is around actually improving trial success. And I think we'll see, probably in 5 years from now, a trial simulation platform or solution of some kind supporting, probably 90% of trials. I think it'll become pretty much a gold standard, right? To have a trial simulation technology or an AI trial supporting every major decision along the trial process. And then I think, I'd also like to share my sort of 10-year vision with you, which is that taking that one step further, I believe that we'll actually be seeing patients that are completely digital and completely, virtual or synthetic. And we already have examples of that today where, for instance, the control arm of a trial is being replaced with data. It's called external control arms, where, instead of recruiting patients for a trial, and then putting half of those patients on the control arm, these companies are actually using data that we already have on these, drugs that are already in the market, in lieu of actually putting patients on trial on these drugs. And so in the end, the end result is you only need to enroll half the number of patients that you normally would to actually get your trial through, which is a huge deal, right? Because again, it's really hard to find patients for trials nowadays, and many times it's even unethical. So that's happening today. And what I think will happen about 10 years from now is we will see that not only do you not have to enroll for half the population in the trial, you actually may not even have to enroll for almost the entire clinical trial or even all of it, because you can do all of it through simulations and through data. Now, of course, at the end of the day, the regulators will still want to see, cold hard numbers from the clinic where real patients are actually receiving the drug. But there is definitely a path towards having these simulations and AI-driven methodologies to play a huge part in that process and to dramatically reduce the number of patients required altogether.
Nicely put. A great closing statement and indeed 10-year vision. Thank you very much, Orr. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find out more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments of the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podbean, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, or X nowadays, at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.